The first thing Matthew Bancroft did when he crossed into New Mexico territory was throw his name away, or at least that was what he intended to do. He had ridden hard for 3 weeks out of Wichita, Kansas, pushing south and west through the long, flat grasslands until the land broke apart into canyon country and red mesa, until the air thinned and the sky turned the particular shade of blue that exists nowhere else on earth. He had left behind a courtroom, a ruined reputation, a dead partner, and a woman who had testified against him with her hand on a Bible and tears running down her face that he now understood had been entirely manufactured for the jury. He had left behind everything he had built in 8 years of honest cattle brokerage, and he had arrived in the territory of New Mexico in the autumn of 1881 with a single bedroll, a Winchester rifle, a horse named Copper who was starting to show his age in the knees, and the sincere and burning intention of becoming no one at all. The town of Cimarron Wells sat at the base of a long red ridge about 40 miles east of the Rio Grande, and Matthew had not planned to stop there. He had not planned to stop anywhere in particular. But Copper threw a shoe 3 miles outside of town, just as the October wind began cutting down from the north, and a man without a horse in New Mexico territory was a man with a very short future. He walked the horse in along the main street at dusk, when the saloon at the far end was already pushing lamplight and piano music out through its bat-wing doors, and the general store was just pulling its shutters closed. The street was the color of dried blood in the failing light, packed red dirt that kicked up in little puffs around Copper's lame-stepping hooves. Matthew kept his hat low, and his eyes moving the way a man does when he has learned, rather recently and rather painfully, that attention is a dangerous thing. He found the livery stable at the north end of the street, a wide-shouldered building that smelled of hay and manure and the particular warm animal smell that had always, even in his worst moments, made Matthew feel slightly less alone in the world. A boy of about 12 was forking hay in the back, and he told Matthew, without looking up, that Mr. Harlow did the shoeing and Mr. Harlow would not be back until morning. Matthew paid for a stall, rubbed Copper down with a spare cloth from his saddlebag, and then stood in the door of the livery looking out at the street, and wondering what he was supposed to do with a whole night in a town he had no intention of knowing. He had $2.30 left in his pocket. Not enough for the hotel, which he could see had a painted sign above its second-floor window that read ROOMS 50 cents per night, and which, even at that price, felt like more of a claim on existence than he wanted to make. He had dried biscuit in his saddlebag that tasted like chalk. He had the cold coming down off the ridge. He was standing there conducting this inventory when the door of the building directly across the street opened, and a woman stepped out carrying something large and awkward, something that turned out, when she had wrestled it past the door frame, to be a cast-iron pot that was clearly too heavy for one person. She was maybe 24 or 25, with dark hair pinned back under a practical hat, and she was wearing a canvas apron over a blue dress, and she was, quite obviously, about to drop the pot. Matthew crossed the street before he had made any conscious decision to do so. He was simply there, taking the other side of the handle, catching the weight of it before it went into the dirt. The woman looked up at him with startled dark eyes, not frightened, he noted, just startled and then immediately assessing in the way of someone who has learned to make quick judgments about people and to trust those judgments. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady and low, the voice of someone who did not get flustered easily. "Where does it go?" Matthew asked. She studied him for one more moment. "Around the back, the kitchen door." They carried the pot around the side of the building together, which turned out to be a restaurant, the sign above the front door reading Ford's Kitchen in plain painted letters. The back door was propped open with a brick, and the kitchen beyond it was warm and smelled powerfully of onions and cornbread, and something slow-cooked that Matthew's hollow stomach recognized before his brain did. They set the pot down on the wide wooden table in the center of the kitchen, and the woman straightened and pressed her hands to the small of her back. "I emptied it first," she said, as if explaining something to herself. "But the thing weighs 20 pounds without anything in it. I keep telling myself I'll get a smaller one." "You run this place?" Matthew asked. "I own it," she said, with a slight but unmistakable emphasis on the word own. "Ella Ford." She held out her hand the way a man would, straight and direct, and Matthew shook it. Her hand was strong and work-calloused and warm from the kitchen. "Matthew Bancroft," he said, and then he heard his own name coming out of his mouth and felt a small, complicated jolt, because he had been so certain he was done with that name. "You just come in?" Ella Ford asked. "Horse through a shoe. I'll be gone in the morning." She looked at him with those quick dark eyes, taking the measure of him the way she had at the beginning, and she must have found something acceptable in what she saw, because she said, "Have you eaten?" He was quiet for one moment too long. "Sit down, Mr. Bancroft," she said, and pointed at a stool near the wall. He sat. He was not sure he had a good argument against it. She served him a bowl of the slow-cooked stew, beef and root vegetables, with a wedge of cornbread on the side and a tin cup of strong coffee, and Matthew Bancroft ate it all without saying a word, and then sat with the empty bowl in front of him, feeling something he could not immediately identify, and then identifying it. He felt like a human being, which was not something he had felt since early spring. "You can sleep in the storeroom," Ella said, coming back from the front of the restaurant where she had been putting chairs up on tables. "It's dry and it's warm and you won't bother anyone." "I have money for the livery," Matthew said. "I'm not asking for money, Mr. Bancroft. I'm offering a storeroom." He looked at her. She was wiping down the counter with even practiced strokes and not looking back at him, which he found, somehow, easier to accept than a direct stare would have been. "Why?" he asked. She paused her wiping and turned to look at him then with a small, slightly impatient expression. "Because you carried my pot and it's getting cold and you have the look of a man who has been sleeping on the ground for too long. That's all. I'm not making you a project and I'm not asking for your story. I'm offering a storeroom." Matthew Bancroft had not cried since the day the verdict came in, and he was not going to cry now, but something in his chest moved in a way that was uncomfortably close to that territory. "Thank you," he said. "There's a blanket on the flour sacks," Ella Ford told him, and went back to wiping the counter. He woke up the next morning stiff and warm and smelling of flour, which was not unpleasant, and he lay in the gray pre-dawn quiet of the storeroom listening to the sounds of Cimarron Wells waking up, the distant crow of a rooster, the creak of a wagon going by on the main street, and beneath all of it the sound of Ella Ford already moving in the kitchen next door, the clank of the cast iron stove being opened, the soft percussion of wood being loaded in, the low tuneless humming that she apparently did when she thought no one was listening. He should get up, collect copper, get the shoe put on, and ride south. He lay there listening to the humming for another 5 minutes. Then he got up and went into the kitchen and said, "Can I help?" Ella Ford turned from the stove with a long-handled spoon in her hand and looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between amused and surprised. "Do you cook?" "No," he said honestly, "but I can chop wood, carry water, shift heavy things that should not be shifted by one person." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "There's an axe by the back door," she said. He split wood for an hour in the cold morning air while the stars faded out and the ridge to the east caught its first line of orange light, and he thought about nothing at all, which was the closest thing to peace he had found since Wichita. When he came back in with a full armload, Ella had biscuits in the oven and coffee on the stove, and she poured him a cup without being asked and went back to her work. There was a man named Earl Potts who came in at 7:30 when Ella opened the front door, a heavy-set man with a sun-damaged neck and a badge on his vest that said deputy, and he sat at the counter and said, "Morning, Ella," with the particular proprietary ease of someone who considers a habit to be the same thing as a right. "Morning, Earl," Ella said, setting his coffee in front of him. Earl Potts noticed Matthew sitting at the far end of the counter with the immediate attention of a man whose job requires noticing strangers. "Who's this?" he asked Ella, but he was looking at Matthew. Matthew Bancroft, Matthew said before Ella could answer. Came in last night. Horse needs a shoe. Leaving today. Earl Potts looked at him for a long moment with the flat professional appraisal of a lawman. Where you from? Kansas, Matthew said. What brings you to the territory? Looking for a change of scenery. Earl Potts made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Lots of folks come to the territory for that. He picked up his coffee. Lots of them find more change than they bargained for. Matthew said nothing to that, which seemed to satisfy Earl Potts, who turned his attention back to Ella and began a running monologue about a dispute over water rights between two ranchers north of town that had apparently been going on for months, and was apparently a source of significant entertainment for the entire town of Cimarron Wells. Matthew ate the biscuits that Ella set in front of him without being asked and drank 2 cups of coffee and listened to the sounds of a small town morning arranging itself around him, and he thought, I should go. He did not go. He went to the livery instead and paid Mr. Harlow, who was a cheerful man with enormous red hands, to shoe Copper, and while Copper was being shod, Matthew walked the single street of Cimarron Wells and looked at it with the detached attention of a man cataloging something he does not expect to need. The town was small but not dying. There was the restaurant, the general store, a hardware and dry goods, a barber shop, a small assay office that had been there since the brief silver excitement of the mid-70s, a land agent's office, the hotel, and the saloon, which was called the Continental in large letters, and which, at 10 in the morning, already had 2 horses tied out front. There was a church at the south end, plain white wood, with a small cemetery beside it where the headstones were mostly new, which told Matthew something about the age of the town. There were perhaps 60 or 70 people living in Cimarron Wells proper, with more on the ranches and farms spreading out across the territory around it. It was the kind of town that existed in the territory the way a campfire exists in open country, defining a small circle of warmth and light against a vast surrounding darkness, not permanent but real and necessary to the people gathered around it. He should ride south. He had nothing here. He was nothing here, which was what he had wanted, but the wanting of nothingness and the actual experience of it were turning out to be different things, and somewhere between the storeroom and the wood splitting and the biscuits and the coffee, the nothingness had gotten complicated. He went back to Ford's kitchen at noon because he was hungry. That was what he told himself. The restaurant was half full with midday customers, and Ella Ford was moving between tables with the efficient grace of someone who has done this work so long it has become physical intuition. She saw him come in and pointed, without breaking her route, at an open stool at the counter, and Matthew sat and watched her work and understood, in a slow and somewhat alarming way, that he was watching her in the manner of a man who finds a person interesting rather than merely a person who provides meals. He was not ready for that. He was specifically not ready for that. He had come to the territory to disappear, and finding a woman interesting was the opposite of disappearing. After the lunch rush thinned out, Ella came and leaned on the counter across from him with a cup of coffee and said, "Your horse gets shod." "Yes," Matthew said. "You're still here," she observed. "I noticed that myself," Matthew said, the almost smile again. "Are you staying, Mr. Bancroft?" He looked at her across the counter and gave her the most honest answer he had, which was, "I don't know." Ella Ford nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable answer, which struck Matthew as remarkable because most people found uncertainty irritating or suspicious. She seemed to find it simply true. "There's a room above the general store that Hector Vance rents out," she said. "It's cheap and it's clean and he doesn't ask a lot of questions." "You make a habit of telling drifting strangers where to find rooms?" Matthew asked. "Only the ones who split my wood," Ella said, and this time the smile came all the way through. It was the first time Matthew had seen her smile fully, and it did something disruptive to his chest, something he chose not to examine too closely. He rented the room above the general store. It cost him 30 cents a week, which left him with almost nothing, and Hector Vance, who was a small, quiet man of about 50 with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead, did indeed not ask a lot of questions. Matthew spent the first week doing what he had told himself he came to the territory to do. He was simply no one. He took meals at Ford's Kitchen because the food was good and the prices were fair, and those were his only reasons, and he told himself this repeatedly. He walked. He sat on the steps of the general store in the evenings and watched the street. He slept deeply and dreamlessly in a way he had not done in months, in the plain, wood-smelling room with the single window that looked out over the ridge. He did not think about Wichita. He tried not to think about Wichita. He mostly succeeded, except in the early mornings before full wakefulness, when the courtroom would reassemble itself in his half-sleeping mind, and he would hear her voice, Helena Marsh, reading from a document that she had signed and that he had never seen before the trial, and he would feel again the particular cold, specific quality of a betrayal that comes from inside the closest circle of trust. By the end of the second week, he had started helping Ella with things without being asked. It was not a decision exactly. It was more like gravity. He was in the kitchen one morning carrying water from the well at the back of the lot, and he noticed that the kitchen door was hanging crookedly on its hinges, and he spent an hour that afternoon fixing it. He noticed that the storage shed behind the restaurant had a section of roof that was lifting at one corner, and he spent a morning on it with a hammer and nails he borrowed from Hector Vance. Ella accepted all of this with the same even-keeled practicality she seemed to apply to everything, thanking him in the direct way that was already becoming familiar, offering meals in return, not asking for explanations or backstory. She treated him like a person who was present, which was different from treating him like a person she knew, and the distinction was one he found, unexpectedly, exactly what he needed. In those early weeks, he learned things about her through observation and through the natural accumulation of small conversations. She was 26 years old. She had come to Cimarron Wells 3 years earlier from Missouri, following the death of her parents to a fever outbreak, traveling with an older married couple named the Hendersons, who had been friends of her family and who had since settled on a farm outside of town. She had bought the restaurant from a man named Ford, unrelated to her, who had been moving on to California, and she had kept the name because it was already painted on the sign and paint cost money. She had built the business herself from nothing, or near to nothing, and she ran it with the kind of focused, practical intelligence that Matthew, who had run his own business in Wichita for 8 years, recognized as genuinely impressive. She had 2 women who helped her part-time. A Mexican woman named Consuelo, who was perhaps 35, and who had a formidable knowledge of chili and spice that had expanded the menu considerably, and a girl of about 18 named Nora, who was saving money for reasons she had not disclosed, but which Ella clearly knew and supported. The town of Cimarron Wells, Matthew came to understand, revolved around Ella Ford in the way that small places always revolve around the people who feed them. Her kitchen was the place where information moved, where disputes were informally mediated, where the community took its temperature and assessed its own health. Earl Potts came every morning. The land agent, a man named Charles Whitfield who wore his suspenders too tight and had opinions about everything, came for lunch and held court. The rancher Thomas Beaumont, who ran the largest spread in the area and whose opinion on water rights was apparently a matter of some consequence, came in on Saturdays. The Henderson family came in on Sundays after church. Matthew began to understand that Ella occupied a particular kind of power in Cimarron Wells, one that was unofficial and unmistakable, and that some of the men in town found confusing, because it did not come attached to any of the conventional markers of authority. He asked her about it one evening in late October when the dinner rush had cleared and she was writing in her account ledger at the counter, and he was sitting across from her with a coffee cooling in front of him. "Do you find it difficult," he asked, "running a business here, by yourself?" Ella looked up from the ledger with an expression that was entirely knowing. "Every single day," she said. "Charles Whitfield told me last spring that I ought to think about selling to him, that it was a lot of responsibility for a woman on her own, and he said it with that particular voice men use when they mean something else entirely." She paused. "I told him the restaurant was not for sale and neither was my time, and I said it in front of 4 other people so it couldn't be misunderstood later." "Good," Matthew said, and he meant it with more force than he had intended, and Ella heard the force in it and looked at him with a slight shift in her expression, something that was beginning to be the look she gave him when he surprised her. "You sound like a man with opinions about that sort of thing," she said. "I've seen what happens when people take things from other people and convince themselves it's for the other person's own good," Matthew said, and he heard the edge in his own voice and pulled back from it deliberately. "I'm sorry that was more than you asked." "Don't apologize," Ella said. She had put down her pen. "I'm not asking for your whole story, Matthew, but I don't mind when pieces of it come out." It was the first time she had used his first name. He was not sure she had noticed she had done it, or whether she had done it deliberately, but either way it moved through him like a low, warm current. "It's not a very pretty story," he said. "Most people's aren't," she said, picking up her pen again and returning to the ledger, giving him the space to say more or to say nothing, entirely without pressure. He said nothing that night. But something in him shifted, some door that had been barred since Wichita moved fractionally in its frame. November came in cold and clear, with nights that dropped well below freezing and days that burned bright and sharp. Matthew had by now made himself genuinely useful in ways that had nothing to do with gravity or proximity, or the fact that Ella Ford had one of those faces that a person kept finding themselves looking for in a room. He had taken on odd jobs around the town, doing the kind of physical labor that small communities always need and never have enough hands for, repairs and hauling and fence mending, and he had accumulated enough money to be comfortable in a modest way. He was not disappearing. He was, in fact, becoming more present by the day, which was the opposite of what he had come for, and he was aware of this with a kind of resigned exasperation directed entirely at himself. The thing that changed everything, or perhaps simply accelerated what was already changing, happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late November. Matthew was coming back from the Beaumont Ranch, where he had spent 2 days helping repair a section of corral fence, and he was riding Copper back along the main street when he saw Charles Whitfield standing in front of Ford's kitchen with 2 other men, blocking the door in a way that was clearly not accidental. One of the men was a ranch hand Matthew had seen before, a tall, thin man with a sour expression. The other was a man Matthew did not recognize, broader and darker, with the look of someone who has been paid to look a certain way. Ella was standing in the doorway, and her voice, when Matthew came close enough to hear it, was controlled but with a very thin layer of control over something that was not. "I've told you, Charles," she was saying. "The answer is the same as it was in April and the same as it was in July, and the answer is no." "I'm trying to help you, Ella," Whitfield said, in a tone that confirmed everything Matthew had heard about him. "The taxes on this building went up this year, and with the winter coming slow on customers, you're going to find yourself in a difficult position. I can offer you a fair price right now before it comes to that." "I'm not in a difficult position," Ella said. "I'm in a position I understand completely, and I'll ask you to move away from my door." Whitfield did not move. The man Matthew didn't know shifted his weight in a way that was not quite a step forward, but was meant to register as a possible one. Matthew dismounted, tied Copper at the hitching post, and came to stand beside Ella in the doorway with the natural ease of someone who belongs there. He did not say anything threatening. He did not put his hand on his gun. He simply stood there and looked at Charles Whitfield with the level, unhurried attention of a man who is not going anywhere. Whitfield looked at him. Something in Whitfield's assessment of the situation rearranged itself. "This is a private conversation," Whitfield said. "The lady asked you to move away from her door," Matthew said, pleasantly and without inflection. There was a long moment. Then Whitfield stepped back, jerking his chin at the two men with him, and the three of them moved off down the street with the particular stride of people who are preserving their dignity, because there is nothing better available to them. Matthew turned to Ella. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, something open and complicated. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Matthew said. "I was handling it," she said. "I know you were," he said, "but you didn't have to handle it alone." She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment something was different between them, some invisible distance that had been maintained politely and mutually, since the night with the pot and the storeroom and the word own had closed slightly. Not all the way, but enough to be felt. "Come inside," Ella said. "The coffee's hot." He sat at the counter and she poured the coffee, and for a while neither of them said anything, and then Ella said, "How much do you actually know about cattle brokerage?" Matthew looked at her. "What makes you ask that?" "You do a good impression of a drifter," Ella said, "but you don't think like one. You handled those books for the Hendersons last week, they told me. You found 3 accounting errors in an hour that they had been carrying for 2 years. Matthew wrapped his hands around the tin cup. "I ran a brokerage in Wichita for 8 years, he said. It was the first time he had said this out loud to anyone since arriving in the territory. Ella nodded slowly. She did not ask the question that followed from that naturally, which was why he was no longer in Wichita running it. She simply filed the information with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything and said, "You could do the books for the restaurant if you wanted. I'll pay fair wages. I'm good with numbers, but there are only so many hours in a day." Matthew looked at her across the counter. He thought, "I came here to be no one." He thought, "I have been no one for 2 months and it is not working the way I thought it would." He said, "All right." The work became a rhythm. He was at the restaurant most mornings by 7, splitting wood and handling the early physical requirements. And then in the afternoons he sat at the small desk that Ella cleared for him near the back wall and went through the accounts with the careful, systematic attention he had always brought to numbers. And the numbers told a story that he found both impressive and slightly worrying. The restaurant was profitable, genuinely so, but the margins were thin in the way they always are when one person is doing the work of 3. And the threat that Charles Whitfield posed was real. Not immediate but real, because Whitfield owned a substantial share of the commercial property in Cimarron Wells. And he was the kind of man who thinks about long-term leverage while appearing to offer short-term help. Matthew wrote up a detailed summary of the accounts and the risks, and a set of 3 options Ella could consider, including one that would require modest outside investment, but would significantly reduce her vulnerability to any pressure on the building's ownership structure. He left it on her desk one evening and went to his room above the general store. And the next morning when he came in, Ella was already there with the papers spread out in front of her and her coffee going cold beside her because she had been reading without drinking it. She looked up at him when he came in, and the expression on her face was one he had not seen from anyone in a long time. It was the expression of a person who has been genuinely seen. "You wrote this up for me last night," she said. "It wasn't complicated," Matthew said. "Matthew," she said, and stopped and started again. "This is more careful and thorough than anything anyone has ever done for me in this town." He sat down across from her and said, "The second option is probably the most realistic given your current cash position. If you can find a business partner you trust to take a minority stake, you protect the building ownership and you have enough cushion to get through 2 bad winters without it being a crisis." Ella looked at him. "Are you offering to be that partner?" He had not consciously thought this until the moment she said it, and then it was simply true. Yes, he was. "I have almost no money," he said. "But I have skills and I have time, and both of those have a value if you want to name it." Ella Ford looked at him for a long, assessing moment, the same look she had given him that very first night when he had appeared out of the dusk to take the other handle of a cast-iron pot, and whatever she saw in him, it was apparently still satisfactory. "Let me think about it," she said. And then more quietly, "But yes, I think yes." It was December now, the nights long and deeply cold, the stars enormous and very close seeming in the clear high-altitude air. Matthew had been in Cimarron Wells for almost 2 months, and the man who had ridden in with the intention of dissolving into the territory was, inconveniently, more himself than he had been in years. He and Ella had settled into a kind of partnership that was part professional, and part something else that neither of them had named yet. They worked well together in the particular way that happens when two competent people occupy complementary skills and have the mutual respect to let each other do their part without interference. He handled the books and the repairs and the heavy work. She cooked with a skill that went beyond mere feeding and into something closer to art, and she ran the floor of the restaurant with the social intelligence of someone who genuinely liked people and understood their needs. Consuelo had started teaching Matthew to make the green chili stew that was the most popular item on the winter menu, which Consuelo found hilarious, and which Matthew endured with the focused application of a man learning a new skill, and which Ella observed from across the kitchen with an expression she was not always successful at keeping neutral. One evening in mid-December, after the last customers had gone and Consuelo and Nora had gone home, and the kitchen was clean, and the fire in the stove was burning low, Matthew and Ella sat together at the counter with the account spread between them and a lamp burning its steady yellow light over the numbers. And somewhere in the course of discussing the winter supply order, the conversation moved sideways into the kind of territory that figures itself out in its own time. "Can I ask you something?" Ella said. "Yes," Matthew said. "What happened in Kansas?" He looked at the account spread on the counter. He looked at the lamp. He looked at Ella Ford, who was watching him with the direct, patient gaze that he had come to understand meant she was asking because she wanted to know, not because she wanted ammunition or because she was filling idle time, but because she considered him a person whose history mattered to her. He told her all of it. He told her about the brokerage he had built, and about his partner David Marsh, who he had trusted completely and who had, it turned out, been skimming from the accounts and covering it with a series of fraudulent invoices. He told her about how David had died in the spring, sudden and early, a heart failure at 42, and how the fraud had surfaced in the aftermath, and how the investigation had fixed on Matthew because the name on the brokerage was his, and because David was dead and could not answer questions. He told her about Helena Marsh, David's wife, who had, in the months between her husband's death and the trial, become someone Matthew believed was his friend, someone he believed was as shocked and confused as he was, and who had, at trial, produced documents signed in Matthew's handwriting that had supposedly authorized the fraudulent invoices, documents that Matthew had never seen before and that he still believed had been forged, but that the jury had found convincing. He told her about the verdict, which was not prison but was destruction, a fine that took everything he had, the dissolution of the brokerage, the end of his name as anything worth having in Wichita. He told her all of it quietly and in order, and when he finished the lamp was burning lower and the stove had gone from warm to merely present, and Ella Ford was looking at him with an expression that was not pity, which was what he would have feared from most people, but was instead a clear and even anger on his behalf. "She forged your signature," Ella said. "I believe so," Matthew said. "I can't prove it." "But you know it," Ella said. "Yes," Matthew said. "I know it." "Then you know it," Ella said, with a finality that struck Matthew somewhere deep. Not fixing it, not solving it, just confirming that his knowledge of his own innocence was real and worth something. He had not expected that. He had, in his darker moments, wondered if even he could fully trust his own certainty. Hearing someone else treat it as simply true did something that months of isolation and long riding had not done. Something loosened in his chest, something that had been held very tight for a very long time. He looked at his hands on the counter. "I came here to disappear," he said. "I know," Ella said. "It didn't work," he said. "No," she agreed, and there was something in her voice that was neither sorry nor entirely neutral, something that sat in the warm and specific territory between. He looked up at her. She was looking back at him without any of the careful distance that they had been maintaining, and the space between them across the counter felt both very small and very significant. "Ella," he said. "Matthew," she said, and both of them were speaking very quietly. "I don't know what I'm offering," he said. "I should say that plainly. I don't have much. I don't have a name worth anything. I don't have a plan past this town." "I didn't ask for a plan," Ella said. "I asked you to do the books." "That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it," Matthew said. The almost smile came, the full one with the warmth behind it. "I know," Ella said. "I just wanted to see if you'd say it plainly." He reached across the counter, very slowly, and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the low lamplight with the account spread between them and the cold outside pressing at the windows, and Matthew Bancroft thought, "This is the opposite of disappearing. This is the most present I have ever been," and he found, with a wonder that surprised him, that this was not frightening at all. It was the closest thing to right that he had felt in longer than he could measure. Ella Ford looked at their joined hands on the counter and then looked up at him, and her expression was entirely open in a way he had not seen from her before, the practical efficiency and the quick assessment and the careful self-possession all still there but softened, made warmer and more specific and more her, and she said, "I've been watching you fix things around here for 2 months, Matthew Bancroft. You fixed my door and my roof and my accounts. You stood in my doorway when I didn't ask you to." "That wasn't subtle," he said. "No," she agreed. "It was not." They looked at each other. The lamp guttered slightly and steadied. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, "if that matters." "It matters," Ella Ford said. Christmas in Cimarron Wells was a modest affair, with a church service that filled the plain white building past its seating capacity, and a communal dinner that took over the main street on a surprisingly mild afternoon. And Ella cooked enough food for the entire town with the help of Consuelo and Nora. And for the first time Matthew, who had graduated from student to assistant in Consuelo's estimation, which was not an elevation given lightly. It was at the Christmas dinner that Earl Potts, who had been watching Matthew with the professional suspicion of a lawman for 2 months, sat down next to him at one of the long outdoor tables and said, without preamble, "I know what happened in Wichita." Matthew went very still. "I wrote to the marshal's office up there about 3 weeks after you came in," Potts said. "Habit. I don't mean anything by it to most men, but you had a look about you that said you came from somewhere specific, and it seemed worth knowing." Matthew looked at the table. Across the street, Ella was laughing at something Mrs. Henderson had said, her head thrown back, and the winter afternoon light was doing something exceptional with the angles of her face. "What did they tell you?" Matthew asked. "Verdict was civil, not criminal," Potts said. "No warrant, no paper. You're not wanted for anything in the territory or elsewhere." "No," Matthew said, "I'm not." "The marshal up there had an opinion about the case," Potts said. He paused. "He said it was thin. Said the jury was convinced by the documents, but there were men in Wichita who were not convinced." Matthew absorbed this. He had not known that. In his worst months after the verdict, he had believed himself to be universally condemned in the place he had spent 8 years building something. "I'm telling you this," Potts said, "because Ella Ford is the best thing in this town, and I'd like to keep it that way, and because, whatever you were in Kansas, what I've seen here is a man who earns what he takes and takes care of what matters. So," he picked up his coffee cup, "Merry Christmas." He moved away down the table, and Matthew sat for a moment with the December sun on his face and something unfurling in his chest like a map being opened. He caught Ella's eye from across the street. She raised an eyebrow in the question. "Are you all right?" He nodded. She went back to Mrs. Henderson, and Matthew Bancroft sat in the winter sun in Cimarron Wells, New Mexico territory, and felt, for the first time in almost a year, that the ground under him was real. January was brutal, the coldest anyone could remember in years according to the older residents of Cimarron Wells, with ice on the water barrels every morning and a wind that came off the ridge with a mean specific intent. The restaurant stayed full because it was warm, and warm was what people needed, and Ella worked the stove from before dawn to after dark every day of that hard month. Matthew was there with her, consistently and entirely. He had, by now, moved himself into a more permanent arrangement. He worked for the restaurant formally, as she had proposed, with a small wage and a small stake in the business that they had documented properly with the help of a lawyer who traveled through from Santa Fe in November. The stake was less than 5% and was earned rather than purchased, but it was real, and it changed the nature of the thing between them in a practical way that made the other change, the one they were also living through, feel more grounded and more real. They were in love. This was a fact that both of them understood clearly by January, though neither had yet said the word, which seemed too simple for the accumulated weight of what had happened between them. They had kissed for the first time on the last day of December, in the kitchen after midnight when the new year had technically arrived, and the distant sound of celebration from the Continental could be heard through the walls. And it had been the kiss of two people who have been building toward something for a long time and who know, with great certainty, that this is exactly where they meant to arrive. The month of February brought a thaw and also a visitor, a man named Willis Arden who arrived on the stage from Las Cruces and checked into the hotel, and came to Ford's kitchen the next morning with the air of someone who has traveled a long way for a specific purpose. He was a solid-built man of about 50 with gray temples and an honest face, and he asked for Matthew Bancroft by name. Matthew was in the back with the accounts when Ella came to tell him there was a man asking for him, and her face had the careful, neutral expression that meant she was withholding her assessment until she had more information. Matthew came to the front and the man stood up from his stool and said, "You don't know me. My name is Willis Arden. I was David Marsh's attorney in Wichita before he passed." Matthew was very still. "I need to talk to you," Arden said. "Privately would be best, but given the circumstances, I'll understand if you prefer a witness." Matthew glanced at Ella, who gave the smallest nod. "Your choice." "Sit down," Matthew said to Arden. "Ella stays." Willis Arden sat. He ordered coffee, and then he laid a leather satchel on the counter and opened it with the deliberate care of a man who has carried something important for a long time. "After the trial," Arden said, "I spent 8 months going through David Marsh's personal papers. What I found is more than enough to establish what actually happened. The documents used against you were produced after David's death. There is a letter in his own handwriting, written 6 weeks before he died, and given to me in a sealed envelope with instruction not to open it for 1 year, in which he describes the fraud in full and specifically states that you had no knowledge of it. He also states that Helena Marsh knew, that she was aware of the fraud from the beginning, and that the documents subsequently produced at trial were created by her using forged samples of your handwriting." The kitchen was entirely silent except for the pop and tick of the stove. "He wrote a confession," Matthew said. "He did," Arden said. "I believe he knew he was in poor health, and I believe his conscience, such as it was, required him to leave some accounting behind. He simply delayed it long enough that his wife had time to act first." He paused. "Helena Marsh was arrested in November. She is currently awaiting trial. The Wichita courts have vacated your civil judgment and restored your legal good standing. I have the paperwork here." He opened the satchel and laid a folded document on the counter. Matthew looked at it but did not pick it up immediately. "I tracked you here through the marshal's office," Arden said. "It took some time. I'm sorry it took this long." Matthew Bancroft looked at the document on the counter. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he picked it up and opened it, and the words in it were exactly what Arden had said they were, and his name was there, cleared, a name he had thrown away in a moment of despair, and that was now being handed back to him, cleaned and repaired. He became aware that Ella's hand was on his arm, warm and steady, and he put his hand over hers without looking up from the document. "What does this mean practically?" Ella said to Arden because Matthew appeared to be temporarily unavailable for conversation. It means Mr. Bancroft's civil judgment is vacated, Arden said. He owes nothing. His professional reputation, as far as the courts are concerned, is restored. There is also the matter of the brokerage's assets, some of which can be recovered and returned, though that process will take some time. He paused. I suspect the amount won't make him wealthy, but it won't be nothing. Matthew set the document down carefully on the counter. Thank you, he said to Arden, for coming. I should have come sooner, Arden said simply. I'm sorry. After Arden left, Matthew and Ella were alone in the kitchen, and the morning light came through the small high window and lay in a long bright stripe across the floor. Ella was watching him. How do you feel? She asked. I don't know yet, he said. I feel like a man who lost something a year ago and just found out it's been returned and who isn't sure what he was planning to do with it now. What do you mean? Matthew turned to look at her. I mean I came here to disappear. I came here without a name or a plan, and I found, he stopped, and then started again. I found something I wasn't looking for, Ella, and I am not willing to lose it in exchange for what I lost before. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Ella Ford looked at him with her whole face open and present. I'm not going anywhere either, she said, if that still matters. It is the most important thing, Matthew said, with a directness that surprised even him. She crossed the kitchen to where he stood and put her hands on either side of his face, and he put his hands on her waist, and they stood together in the stripe of morning light with the document on the counter and the future arranged in front of them, completely present, entirely real. Spring came to the territory in a rush, the way it always does in New Mexico, seemingly overnight, the brown of winter giving way to the particular green gold of new grass on the mesa, and the cottonwoods along the waterways exploding into yellow-green leaf. The ridge above Cimarron Wells turned a color that Matthew had no name for, somewhere between coral and rust, and it caught the light in the late afternoon in a way he had taken to watching from the front step of Ford's kitchen with a coffee in his hand, and a feeling in his chest that he had come to identify without embarrassment as happiness. He had written back to Wichita through Arden to begin the process of recovering what was recoverable, and he had made a decision that Arden had found surprising. He did not want to go back. He wanted the legal restoration of his name, and he wanted whatever small recovery of assets was possible, and then he wanted to close the book on Wichita permanently and build something new in a place that had earned his loyalty by feeding him and hiding him, and then, entirely against his will, making him visible again. There were things about the territory that he was coming to understand with the slow education of a man who is paying attention. He was learning the rhythms of the land, the way the seasons moved differently here than in Kansas, the sudden violence of the thunderstorms that came up in the afternoons in spring and then cleared as quickly as they came. He was learning the social landscape, the complicated history of the land and the people on it. Thomas Beaumont had been having an ongoing dispute with two neighboring ranchers about water rights along the creek, and Matthew had spent several evenings in the restaurant listening to the shape of the dispute, and then, at Ella's suggestion, had offered to look at the original land filings for all three ranches. What he found was that the original filings contained a shared-use provision that had never been formally recognized or acted on, and that if it were, all three parties would be better off than any of them was under the current fighting arrangement. He had presented this in the restaurant, over coffee, with Beaumont on one side and the neighboring rancher, a weathered man named Ike Stubbs, on the other, and Earl Potts as witness. And after considerable argument, they had reached an agreement that Potts wrote up and had properly filed. Beaumont had shaken Matthew's hand afterward and said, "You're useful, Bancroft," in the tone of a man who does not give that assessment lightly, and Matthew had understood that this was a kind of acceptance that mattered in this place. He also understood, during these months, the deeper injustices that ran through the territory like a buried current. The land itself had a complicated history, and the Apache and Navajo peoples who had been on this land for generations before the territory existed had been systematically pushed from their own ground through a combination of violence and bureaucracy and legal maneuvering that made what had happened to Matthew Bancroft in a Wichita courtroom look like a minor inconvenience by comparison. He had conversations with Consuelo, whose own family's history in the territory went back generations, that gave him a fuller picture of what this land had cost people who had not chosen to give it. He did not pretend these were simple problems or that he had solutions for them. But he carried the knowledge with him, and he let it inform the way he moved in this place, with the awareness that the ground he walked on had a history he was not the author of but that he was responsible to know. It was on an April evening, warm and blue, with the smell of desert flowers coming through the open kitchen window, that Matthew said to Ella after dinner, with the restaurant empty and the lamplight doing its particular warm work on the room, "I want to ask you something." Ella looked up from the account books which she had been going through with the new system he had put in place. She set down her pen. "All right," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," Matthew said. "And I want to ask it properly, which means I want to tell you first what I'm asking you to take on. I have a restored name and a small recovered fund from Wichita, but I am not a wealthy man, and I may never be. I have a 5% stake in this restaurant that I intend to earn into something more substantial, and I intend to be here for the rest of my life, and I intend to make this place something worth being part of. And I love you with a specificity and a depth that I could not have invented if I had tried. And I came here to disappear, and instead I found the one person who made disappearing entirely impossible, and I am more grateful for that than I know how to say." He had said all of this while looking at her steadily and directly, and she had listened with the same quality of attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. And when he stopped, she was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then she said, "Yes, Matthew Bancroft. Yes, I will marry you." She came around the counter and he stood up and they held each other in the warm lamplight of Ford's kitchen with the April night coming in through the window, and Matthew pressed his face into her hair and thought, "This is the place I was riding toward all along. I just didn't know its name." They were married in June in the plain white church at the south end of Cimarron Wells on a morning that was clear and warm with a high blue sky, and the kind of stillness that the territory produces in early summer before the afternoon builds toward weather. The whole town came, because in a small place a wedding is the town's own event as much as the couple's. Ella wore a dress that she and Consuelo had made, dark blue cotton with white at the collar and cuffs, and she walked down the short aisle with Mr. Henderson on her arm because she had no father living, and Matthew stood at the front with Earl Potts beside him as witness, which was a development that had surprised them both, but which had grown naturally out of the strange and unlikely friendship that had developed over the winter. The minister read the words that have been read in small towns and large cities, and on open ground since there have been people who wanted to make a public promise to each other. And Matthew and Ella spoke their vows with the directness and weight of two people who have earned the meaning of what they are saying. When they came out of the church into the June morning, the town had arranged itself in the street in the way of small places, loose and celebratory, and Consuelo and Nora had set tables out in front of the restaurant, and there was food enough for everyone and the sound of a fiddle from somewhere down the street. And the day arranged itself into the kind of celebration that a community makes when it wants to witness its own best moments. That evening, when the celebration had wound down and the tables were cleared and the fiddle had gone quiet, Matthew and Ella sat together on the step of Ford's kitchen in the warm dusk, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the street where the last lamplight was making long yellow rectangles on the packed dirt. "Ella Bancroft," Matthew said, trying out the sound of it. "I'm keeping Ford's kitchen," Ella said. "Of course you are," Matthew said. "It's the best name in town." She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The stars came out over the ridge. the enormous high-altitude stars that had frightened him a little when he first rode in, and that now felt like the same sky he had always lived under, only more honest about its own size. "Are you happy?" Ella asked. Matthew Bancroft thought about a Kansas courtroom and a dead partner and a forged signature, and a cold winter ride south with nothing left. He thought about a cast-iron pot in the dusk and a warm storeroom and biscuits and coffee, and a woman who said you didn't have to handle it alone. "Yes," he said, "completely." The summer passed in a warm abundance of work and light. The restaurant expanded. Matthew, with the partial recovery from the Wichita matter, invested in a proper addition to the back of the building, adding 2 tables and a proper preparation area that Consuelo had long wanted, and that increased the efficiency of the kitchen considerably. Ella negotiated a new supply arrangement with a wholesaler out of Santa Fe that reduced their costs on staples by nearly a third, and the restaurant's margins strengthened in a way that began to feel, for the first time, genuinely secure. Matthew also took on additional work. At Thomas Beaumont's recommendation, he was handling the accounts for 3 of the larger ranches in the area, which kept him busy and which, perhaps more importantly, continued to weave him into the fabric of Cimarron Wells in a way that had become genuinely mutual. He was not just present in this place. He was needed. The distinction mattered to him. Earl Potts had, by the height of summer, stopped watching Matthew with the professional wariness of a lawman cataloging a potential problem, and had settled into something that could fairly be described as friendship, which involved a great deal of conversation over coffee in the early mornings before the restaurant opened, and a running chess game played on a board Potts kept in the deputy's office that neither of them was winning in any consistent way. Nora, who had been saving her wages with such focus and determination, revealed in August that she had enough to travel to Albuquerque to take a course in nursing, which had been her plan all along, and Ella, who had known this and supported it quietly the whole time, threw a small going-away dinner that made everyone cry in the pleasant way of endings that are also beginnings. Consuelo took on a new assistant, a young woman named Pillar who was Consuelo's cousin's daughter, and who turned out to have inherited the family's considerable culinary gifts, and the 2 of them together produced food that people were beginning to travel specifically to Cimarron Wells to eat, which was a development that Matthew noted in the accounts with considerable satisfaction. In September, Ella told Matthew she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday morning when the restaurant was closed, and they were sitting together at the kitchen table with their coffee, in the particular easy quiet of 2 people who have learned to inhabit the same space without filling all of it with noise. And she said it with the directness that was entirely her, looking at him across the table with her hands around her cup and her face open and waiting to see how he would receive it. He set down his cup. He looked at her across the table, this woman who had housed him when he was a stranger and fed him when he was hungry and listened to his whole ruined story without flinching and married him on a clear June morning in front of an entire town. "Ella," he said, and his voice had done something, and she smiled the full warm smile and reached across the table and took his hand. "A baby Matthew," she said. "I heard you," he said, though his voice was still doing the same thing. She laughed. He laughed. They sat across the table from each other laughing, and then they were on the same side of the table because he had come around to her, and he held her and she held him back, and the Sunday morning light came through the kitchen window and lay over them, warm and particular and entirely their own. The autumn was full and busy and golden. Ella continued to work through her pregnancy with the practical stubbornness that was characteristic of her, making adjustments where she had to, but refusing to treat pregnancy as an illness or an excuse to stop running the thing she had built. Matthew matched her practicality with his own, taking on more of the physical work and less of the accounting temporarily, and making sure that Consuelo and Pillar were equipped to handle more of the kitchen operations as Ella's condition advanced. Charles Whitfield had, following his retreat from Ella's door in November, and the subsequent public knowledge that she was now partnered with Matthew Bancroft and backed by the kind of legal documentation that made coercion genuinely difficult, redirected his attentions to other targets. He made one last attempt in October, approaching Matthew directly with an offer to buy out the building on favorable terms, and Matthew had declined with the pleasant firmness that he had, over many months, developed as his primary tone with Whitfield. And Whitfield had gone away and not come back, and the general opinion of Cimarron Wells was that this was the best possible outcome for everyone, including Whitfield himself. Matthew also received, in October, the final accounting from Willis Arden in Wichita. The recovered assets were modest but real, enough to clear any remaining concerns about the restaurant's financial position, to properly fund the addition that had been built, and to leave a comfortable reserve. Helena Marsh had been convicted at trial, not of the original fraud, which was difficult to prove with David dead, but of the forgery and of perjury at Matthew's trial, and she had been sentenced accordingly. Matthew read this in Arden's letter with a feeling that was not satisfaction, exactly, but was the quiet specific feeling of a door being properly closed. He wrote back to Arden, thanking him, and told him that he would not be returning to Wichita, that his life was here now, and that he wished Arden well. He sealed the letter and handed it to the mail rider on a cool October morning, and when the rider disappeared down the main street and around the bend south of town, Matthew stood for a moment in the road and breathed the clean, high-altitude air and felt the completeness of that particular ending. He turned and went back inside. The baby came in February, on a night of deep cold with ice on every window in Cimarron Wells, in the bedroom above the restaurant that Matthew and Ella had made their home over the summer, with the midwife Mrs. Caldera in attendance and Consuelo downstairs, making what turned out to be an enormous quantity of food that no one had asked for and that everyone was grateful for. It was a boy. Matthew was allowed in when it was over, and he came to the bed where Ella lay, tired and radiant in the particular way of a woman who has just done something enormous, and the midwife placed the bundle in his arms with the brisk efficiency of someone who has done this many times and who still, Matthew noticed, smiled when she did it. He looked at the face of his son. He had expected to feel many things, love, obviously, and fear, certainly, and the particular vertiginous quality of becoming responsible for a new and entirely helpless person. He had not expected the specific quality of the feeling, which was like looking at something that made the world larger, that expanded the possible rather than limiting it. "He's all right," Matthew said to Mrs. Caldera. "He is perfect," Mrs. Caldera said firmly. Matthew sat on the edge of the bed beside Ella and she leaned against him and they looked at their son together. "What do we call him?" Ella asked. "I don't know," Matthew said. "What do you want?" Ella was quiet for a moment. "Thomas," she said. "After my father." "Thomas Bancroft," Matthew said, trying the sound. "Thomas James Bancroft," Ella said. "James was your father's name, you told me once." He had told her once in passing months ago, and she had kept it because she kept the things that mattered. "Yes," Matthew said, "Thomas James Bancroft." He put his free arm around his wife, and his wife leaned against him, and their son slept between them, new and warm and entirely himself. And outside the ice was on all the windows, and the stars over the ridge were their cold, enormous selves. And inside there was the lamp and the warmth of the stove, and three people who had found each other in the middle of a territory that had seemed, to one of them, like the end of everything. The winter of young Thomas's first months was a period Matthew would later identify as the time when Cimarron Wells became, fully and without qualification, home. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the accumulation of the ordinary, the mornings in the kitchen, the sound of the town coming awake, the coffee and the accounts and the cold air through the window and Ella's voice moving between the kitchen and the front of the restaurant and the small specific sounds of a baby learning to exist in the world. He also fell into the habit, in this period, of walking the town in the early evenings when the light was going and the day was finishing itself. He knew every building now, every face. He knew the sound the ridge made in the wind and the way the water in the well tasted different in winter than in summer. He knew which horses belonged to which ranches and which saddles to look for on the hitching posts to know who was in town on a given day. He was known in return, not just recognized, but known, in the way a community knows the people who are woven into it, not for what they were before or what they might become, but for what they do here and now in this specific place, with these specific people. He thought sometimes about the man who had ridden in a year and a half ago on a lame horse with 30 cents and a destroyed name, and a profound desire to stop existing in any recognizable form. He found that man comprehensible and even sympathetic, but entirely past. He was not that man anymore. He was Matthew Bancroft of Cimarron Wells, New Mexico Territory. He was the man who did the accounts for 4 ranches and fixed things that needed fixing and stood in doorways when they mattered and was known for his green chili stew, which was still not quite as good as Consulo's but which was genuinely respectable. He was Ella Ford's husband. He was Thomas James Bancroft's father. These were not small things. They were, in fact, the largest things he knew. Spring came again, Thomas's first spring, and the territory greened up around the red rock in that improbable annual way, and the cottonwoods along the creek went yellow gold, and the air smelled of something clean and possible. And Ella took Thomas out into the kitchen garden behind the restaurant in the mornings and let him feel the dirt with his hands, which he appeared to find profoundly interesting, and Matthew would come out and find the two of them like that. Ella crouched with her hair loose because she had not had time to pin it yet, Thomas sitting in the dirt with concentration on his small, round face, and the morning light making everything it touched the same warm gold. He would stand in the kitchen doorway and watch them for a moment before either of them noticed him. He would think, I rode into this town to dissolve. I rode in looking for the kind of forgetting that comes when a man makes himself small enough to slip through the world without catching on anything. I thought disappearing was a form of safety. What I found instead was this: a woman who noticed me, who fed me, who gave me work and fought her own battles and had no patience for my self-pity but infinite patience for my actual self. A town that was willing to let me be useful. A son who looks like me around the eyes and like his mother around the mouth, and who is, at the age of 6 months, already the most interesting person I have ever met. He would think, I was wrong about what I needed. Most spectacularly, most fortunately wrong. And then Ella would look up and see him in the doorway, and her face would do the thing it always did when she saw him, which was to open, to be fully present and fully glad. And she would say, Stop standing there and come help. And Thomas would look up too and wave his hands in the particular excited way of a baby recognizing his father. And Matthew Bancroft would step off the threshold and into the morning. 2 years after Matthew rode into Cimarron Wells on a lame horse, Ford's Kitchen was the most prosperous business in town by a considerable margin. Consulo and Pillar had developed a menu that drew travelers from the stage routes 50 miles in either direction, and there was genuine discussion in the spring of 1883 of whether to expand the building again, a discussion that involved considerable architectural deliberation between Matthew, Ella, and Consulo, who had strong opinions about the location of windows in relation to cooking surfaces. They expanded in June, the same month as their 2nd anniversary, adding a full dining room that doubled their seating capacity and a new kitchen with the proper window placement that Consulo had specified. And the building that had been one woman's modest restaurant was now a proper establishment that looked, from the outside, like what it was: something built to last. The celebration of their anniversary that year was a quiet evening, just the two of them after Thomas was asleep, with a bottle of wine that Matthew had ordered especially from Santa Fe through a trading connection he had made with a merchant there. They sat in the new dining room, which still smelled of fresh wood and paint, and Ella looked around at the walls and the windows and the long tables with the good oil lamps on them, and she said, "I keep thinking about when it was just the one room and the pot I couldn't carry." "You could carry it," Matthew said. "You were doing it." "I was about to drop it," Ella said. "You would have managed," Matthew said. "Yes," she said, "but I didn't have to." She looked at him across the table with the look that was entirely specific to him, the one that had no practical calculation in it, only warmth and depth and the particular intimacy of two people who have seen each other completely and chosen each other anyway. "Matthew," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad you didn't disappear," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, the same way they had held hands across the counter of the restaurant on a December night that seemed both very recent and very long ago. "I tried," he said. "I know you did," she said with a small smile. "You made it impossible," he said. "I know that too," she said. They sat together in the new dining room of Ford's kitchen with the wine and the good lamp and the smell of fresh wood, and the quiet of a house with a sleeping child in it. And outside the stars were their enormous reliable selves over the ridge, and Cimarron Wells was settled and dark and present around them, and Matthew Bancroft was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, which was this: being here. Being entirely, irrevocably, gratefully here. 3 years after the night of the cast-iron pot, Ella found out she was expecting their second child. She told Matthew on a Sunday morning again, in the kitchen again, with the coffee between them, and this time he did not have to come around the table because he was already beside her, and he pulled her against him and pressed his lips to her hair and held her while she laughed. "Another one," she said against his shoulder. "Another one," he said. The pregnancy was easier than the first in some ways and harder in others, and Ella moved through it with the same practical, unstoppable energy that she brought to everything. And in the early autumn of 1883, she gave birth to their second child, a daughter this time. They named her Rose Margaret, Margaret for Ella's mother, and she came into the world on a September morning with the clear light coming through the window and the smell of the kitchen below moving through the house. And she was, from the first moment, exactly herself, bright-eyed and alert, looking at the world with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere interesting. Thomas, who was 18 months old and deeply invested in his own assessment of the world, inspected his sister with great seriousness, and then, apparently satisfied, went back to his primary activity, which was attempting to pull everything within his reach off every surface within his reach. Earl Potts came that evening to congratulate them, which he did with the gruff, affectionate efficiency of a man who feels things deeply and expresses them efficiently, shaking Matthew's hand and telling Ella she looked well, which was true, and leaving them with a smoked ham that he had apparently prepared the previous day in anticipation, which was the kind of practical and thoughtful gesture that was characteristic of him when he chose to let it be. That night, with both children asleep and the house quiet, Ella and Matthew sat together on the step outside the back door of the kitchen, looking at the dark shape of the ridge against the September stars. It was warm still, the last of the summer warmth, the kind of night that knows it is one of the last of its kind and conducts itself accordingly. "Are you happy?" Matthew asked her, the same question she had asked him 2 years ago on the step of the restaurant. Ella leaned against his shoulder. "Completely," she said, which was his own word returned to him, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and the word between them was full and warm and entirely sufficient. Matthew Bancroft put his arm around his wife in the September night and looked out at the dark ridge and the enormous stars, and he thought about a man on a lame horse riding toward the territory with 30 cents and a destroyed name and the intention of becoming nobody at all. He thought, that man found something. He found it without looking for it, which is the only way it ever really works. He found it in a dark street and a heavy pot, and a warm storeroom and biscuits that tasted like something worth staying for. He found it in Ella Ford, who saw him clearly and immediately, and whose patience for his self-erasure had been, mercifully, limited, who had handed him work and space and the daily ordinary business of being needed until he had almost accidentally rebuilt himself into something real. He found it in this town, which had accepted him the way small places accept people who earn their place, slowly and practically and completely. He found it in the children asleep inside, in the accounts that were balanced and the building that was expanded and the name on the sign above the door. He found it here, in this place, on this night. Sitting on this step with this woman who had made disappearing entirely impossible from the first moment, she turned and looked at him with those quick dark eyes and said, in that low, steady voice that he would hear in his ears until his last day, "Thank you." The territory spread out around them in the dark, enormous and old and indifferent to the smallness of human lives, but within the circle of the lamp burning in the kitchen behind them, within the warmth of the walls they had built and the business they had grown and the family they were making, everything was exactly the right size. He was Matthew Bancroft of Cimarron Wells. He was a husband and a father and a man who did the accounts for 4 ranches and had strong opinions about roof repairs and whose green chili stew was, by now, genuinely excellent. He had come to the territory to disappear. He had found instead exactly this, the particular and specific gravity of being fully alive, fully known, fully loved in a place that was entirely and permanently his own. He had found Ella Ford, and that had made all the difference.